Introduction: The Setting of the Sun. Welcome to one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of human conflict. Today we step back in time to December the 2nd, 1805. We find ourselves on the chilly, fog-covered plains of Moravia, in what is now the Czech Republic. This is the story of the Battle of Austerlitz, also known as the Battle of the Three Emperors. On one side stands the 36-year-old Emperor of the French, Napoleon Bonaparte. On the other side, the combined might of the Russian Empire under Tsar Alexander I and the Austrian Empire under Holy Roman Emperor Francis II. To understand the magnitude of this day, one must understand the stakes. Napoleon had recently crowned himself emperor, a move that shocked the old monarchies of Europe. They saw him as an upstart, a Corsican ogre who needed to be put in his place. England, Russia, and Austria formed the Third Coalition to crush him. But Napoleon was not a man who waited to be crushed. He marched his Grande Armée hundreds of miles from the coast of France into the heart of Europe with a speed that left his enemies breathless. However, by late November, Napoleon was in a dangerous spot. He was deep in enemy territory, his supply lines were stretched thin, and he was outnumbered. The Allies had nearly 90,000 men, while Napoleon had only about 68,000. The deception, setting the trap. Most generals, when faced with superior numbers, would retreat or dig in for a defensive fight. But Napoleon was not most generals. He decided to win the battle before the first shot was even fired. He began a psychological game of cat and mouse. He deliberately made his army look weak, tired, and disorganized. He sent his diplomats to the Tsar, acting as if he were desperate for a peace treaty. He even ordered his troops to abandon the most strategic high ground in the area, the Pratzen Heights. To the Russian and Austrian commanders, this looked like a retreat in disguise. They thought Napoleon was terrified. They saw his right flank, near the village of Telnitz, was thinly guarded. The Allied plan seemed obvious. They would launch a massive strike on Napoleon's right flank, cut off his line of retreat to Vienna, and surround his army. This was exactly what Napoleon wanted them to think. He had intentionally weakened his right wing to lure the Allies into a trap. He knew that if the Allies moved their troops from the center to attack his right, their own center would become thin and vulnerable. This was the gamble of a lifetime. The morning of conflict. The night before the battle was the first anniversary of Napoleon's coronation. His soldiers, despite the freezing cold, lit torches and cheered for their emperor, shouting, "Vive l'Empereur!" It was a haunting sight for the Allied observers on the heights above. At dawn on December 2nd, a thick, heavy mist clung to the valleys. You couldn't see more than a few paces in front of you. This fog was Napoleon's best friend. It hid his main force, the Fourth Corps under Marshal Davout, who were tucked away in the valley bottoms, ready to strike the center. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the Allied columns began their descent from the Pratzen Heights, moving toward Napoleon's right flank. They fell upon the French lines with fury. For a moment, it looked like the French might break, but Napoleon had a secret weapon: Marshal Davout. Davout and his men had marched an incredible 70 miles in just 48 hours to reach the battlefield. They arrived just in time to bolster the right flank. The fighting was brutal, hand-to-hand combat in the marshes and villages, but the French held their ground just long enough. The Lion's Leap. By 9 o'clock, the sun began to burn through the fog. This is the famous Sun of Austerlitz. As the mist cleared, Napoleon looked through his telescope and saw that the Pratzen Heights were almost empty. The Allies had moved nearly all their men to the flanks. Turning to Marshal Soult, Napoleon asked, "How long will it take your men to reach the heights?" Soult replied, "Less than 20 minutes, sire." Napoleon waited a few more moments, ensuring the trap was fully set, and then gave the order, "One sharp blow, and the war is over." The French columns emerged from the fog like ghosts. The Allied commanders were horrified to see thousands of French bayonets glistening in the sun, rising right in the middle of their lines. The French charged up the slopes of the Pratzen Heights. The fighting at the center was the most intense of the day. The Russian Imperial Guard was brought in to stop the French, leading to a legendary clash of elite cavalry. Sabers clashed, horses screamed, and the ground shook. But the French momentum was unstoppable. By noon, the Allied center had been shattered. The Russian and Austrian armies were now cut in half. The collapse and the frozen lakes. With the center broken, Napoleon's army began to wrap around the Allied wings. The retreat turned into a panicked rout. Thousands of Allied soldiers fled toward the south, where they tried to cross the frozen Satschan ponds. Napoleon, seeing the opportunity, ordered his artillery to fire not at the men, but at the ice. The heavy cannonballs smashed the frozen surface, and hundreds of fleeing soldiers were plunged into the icy waters. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the roar of the cannons began to fade. The Battle of the Three Emperors was over. The French had lost about 9,000 men, but the Allies had lost over 27,000, either killed, wounded, or captured. The Austrian Emperor Francis immediately sued for peace, and the Russian army limped back home in disgrace. Legacy of the Great Victory. Austerlitz was the death blow to the Holy Roman Empire, and the beginning of Napoleon's undisputed mastery over Europe. In his post-battle proclamation, Napoleon told his men, "Soldiers, I am pleased with you. When you return to your homes, you need only say, 'I was at the Battle of Austerlitz,' and people will reply, 'There is a brave man.'" This battle remains a textbook example of how a smaller, more agile force can defeat a larger enemy through deception, timing, and nerves of steel. It was the moment Napoleon's star shone brightest, a day when the map. This is the second part of the Battle of Austerlitz transcript, expanding on the tactical maneuvers, the specific heroics of the marshals, the chaotic retreat, and the profound political aftermath. It is written with a rhythmic flow optimized for text-to-speech (TTS). Part 2. The Shattering of Empires. The Crisis at the Center. As we move into the second act of this great drama, the morning mist has fully lifted, revealing the sun of Austerlitz. But the sunlight brought no warmth, only the cold clarity of a battlefield in chaos. On the Pratzen Heights, the very heart of the Allied position, a desperate struggle was unfolding. When Marshal Soult's Fourth Corps emerged from the fog like a ghost army, the Russian and Austrian commanders were paralyzed with disbelief. They had assumed the French were miles away, retreating in fear. Instead, they found the Iron Marshal and his veteran infantry charging up the steep slopes with bayonets fixed. The Russian Tsar, Alexander I, realized his mistake too late. He desperately ordered his elite reserves, the Russian Imperial Guard, to retake the heights. These were the tallest, strongest, and most decorated soldiers in the Russian Empire. Led by the Grand Duke Constantine, the Russian cavalry smashed into the French line. For a few terrifying moments, the French began to buckle. One French battalion lost its eagle, the sacred bronze standard of the regiment. When Napoleon saw this from his command post, he didn't panic. He turned to his aide and calmly ordered the French Imperial Guard cavalry to counterattack. The clash of the guards. What followed was perhaps the most spectacular cavalry charge in the history of the Napoleonic Wars. Thousands of elite horsemen, the finest in Europe, collided at full gallop on the blood-stained snow of the Pratzen. The sound was like 1,000 hammers hitting an anvil. The French Mamelukes, with their curved sabers, and the grenadiers à cheval, known as the Giants, tore through the Russian ranks. The ground literally shook under the weight of the charging horses. Within 30 minutes, the Russian guard was broken, and the Eagle was recaptured. Napoleon had regained control of the heights, and with it, he held the key to the entire battlefield. The Allied army was now physically sliced in two. The southern cauldron. While the center was being shattered, the situation on the French right flank, the trap Napoleon had set, was reaching its boiling point. General Davout's men, exhausted from their legendary march, were fighting like demons in the village of Telnitz. They were outnumbered 3-1, but they used the narrow streets and stone houses to turn the village into a fortress. Every yard of ground was paid for in blood. The Allied commanders, still focused on breaking the French right, kept pouring more and more troops into the south, unaware that their center had already collapsed behind them. By early afternoon, Napoleon saw that the Allied left wing was completely isolated. He ordered his artillery on the Pratzen Heights to turn their guns around and fire down into the valley. It was a massacre. The Allied soldiers, trapped between Davout's iron defense and the French cannons firing from the heights above, had nowhere to go. The disciplined ranks of the Russian and Austrian infantry dissolved into a panicked mass of humanity. Thousands of men began to flee toward the only exit they could see, the frozen Satschan ponds. The tragedy of the frozen ponds. This remains one of the most controversial and haunting moments of the battle. As thousands of Russian soldiers stepped onto the thick ice of the ponds, hoping to escape the French bayonets, Napoleon gave a chilling order. He commanded his heavy batteries to fire round shot at the ice. The heavy iron balls didn't hit the men. They smashed the frozen surface into millions of pieces. The ice groaned and shattered. In an instant, the cold water of the ponds swallowed hundreds of men, horses, and cannons. The screams of the drowning men could be heard over the roar of the guns. While modern historians debate the exact number of casualties in the ponds, the psychological impact was absolute. The Allied spirit was crushed. The aftermath, a map redrawn. By 4:30 in the afternoon, a cold silence began to fall over Moravia, broken only by the moans of the wounded. The three emperors were no longer equals. Tsar Alexander and Emperor Francis were in full flight, their armies scattered to the winds. Napoleon, however, rode across the field, stopping to offer brandy to his wounded soldiers and praising their bravery. He knew he had just achieved the impossible. The political consequences were immediate and earth-shattering. Within weeks, the Treaty of Pressburg was signed. Austria was forced to give up vast territories in Italy and Germany. More importantly, the 1,000-year-old Holy Roman Empire was abolished, replaced by a string of French-controlled states known as the Confederation of the Rhine. Napoleon was no longer just the emperor of the French. He was now the arbiter of Europe. Final reflection. Austerlitz was not just a victory of numbers, it was a victory of the mind. Napoleon had looked at the terrain, understood the psychology of his enemies, and used their own pride against them. He turned a position of weakness into a position of absolute power. For the rest of his life, even during his exile on the lonely island of St. Helena, Napoleon would look back at this December day as his finest hour. It was the day the world learned that as long as the sun of Austerlitz was shining, the French eagle would remain invincible. Chapter of Europe was rewritten by the stroke of a sword and the roar of a cannon.